From the late 19th century to the late 20th, more than 150,000 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children were taken from their families, removed from their communities, and forced to attend residential schools across much of our country. This week's Truth and Reconciliation report lays out 94 recommendations to address this dark chapter in Canada's history. Joining us now for her view on the report and what looms next is Catherine Hensel, a Secwepemc lawyer with a litigation practice serving First Nations and Indigenous people and organizations across Canada. Catherine, hello.
Good afternoon.
Okay, so this report came out Tuesday. It has been in the making for many years with the TRC. Just remind us, at the end of Tuesday, what was always meant to happen with this report? How's it meant to be used?
It's meant to be a resource for government, for the public, for educators, for courts, for all of Canada. The public body that is Canada to rely on for specific information, for analysis, for recommendations.
And it's also, the process was also to help the people who went to residential schools. How do you see it, now many years on since the testimony stuff, how do you see it helping them?
Well, it gave them an opportunity and a venue and a reason to tell their stories in a public way that would be captured for all time for Canada and for First Nations and Indigenous people across Canada. It allowed them to speak of things much of in First Nations and in Indigenous communities had not been spoken of for many, many years, and the silence on it was harmful. So
because of shame.
Because of shame and trauma, because it was too painful to speak about in many families I know. It was simply something that was not even referred to indirectly because of the anguish that even an indirect reference to residential school caused for grandpa or grandma or mom or dad.
And as the testimony continued, the TRC listened to hundreds of people, and so much the testimony was moving, much of it was difficult, people describing being physically and sexually abused, forced to change religions, being told that they were savages. One man who had his hair cut off and then thrown in the garbage, despite that having a spiritual significance. A woman recalled being forced to lie in the snow for hours. Those are horrendous stories, horrendous things that happened. How typical were those?
Well, what was universal was the separation. Every child was separated from their family, from their loved ones, from their culture and community. That was an intentional aspect. That was the point of residential schools. So that was universal. I think physical and sexual and emotional and cultural abuse was pervasive enough to be, if children didn't experience it directly, I'd say most of them were aware of it, and many, many, many children experienced at least punitive discipline, and they were in an environment where there was no protection from all those types of abuse, and they knew it.
And just a reminder to our viewers, this isn't something that happened ages ago. Last residential school closed down '96, right?
Yes, and I work with a lot of communities where every member of the elected council, chief and council, for example, they're all in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Every single person attended residential school. That's not unusual at all.
And there was a lot of talk, not just by the survivors themselves, but about their families and the impact that it had on them, intergenerational. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's had a devastating and really obvious intergenerational impact on children today, parents today. Even if they didn't themselves, young parents didn't attend residential school, more often than not, their parents did, their aunts, their uncles did, their grandparents did. So they were raised by people who are raised in an institutional, lonely, alienating, abusive environment. And through the generations, they've struggled to parent themselves, to parent their own children. And insofar as they have not been ideal parents and not had the skills and the capacity to parent well, then their own children. It's repeated generation after generation, even when residential schools is a couple of generations back.
Okay, so the report's recommendations came out earlier this week. There are 94 recommendations, kind of cover a gamut from health to education to reconciliation and, of course, truth. What surprised you about the findings?
I wasn't surprised by any aspect of the I work with residential school survivors. I often litigate with reference to the impact, intergenerational and direct impact of residential school. I thought it was a very rigorous, well thought out, nuanced and helpful, potentially very helpful roadmap for Canadian society, for government, for Canadians, and for all the various public actors.
Okay, we're going to play a bit of tape. This is from Justice Murray Sinclair, who's the chair of the commission. This is him speaking earlier this week.
This has been a difficult, inspiring, and very painful journey for all of us. The residential school experience is clearly one of the darkest, most troubling chapters in our collective history. In the period from Confederation until the decision to close residential schools was taken in this country in 1969, Canada clearly participated in a period of cultural genocide.
Okay, Catherine, there it is. That was the term that Justice Sinclair used, cultural genocide. That did surprise many people. That didn't surprise you, that the use of that term?
No. Given my understanding of the international and domestic definition of genocide in the criminal code and through the various UN instruments, it's directly the stated explicit objectives of the residential school social experiment and project were to assimilate and in doing so eliminate Indigenous people in Canada as peoples. That's genocide, and it was done through very brutal means, but through the forceful removal of children. That's a hallmark of genocide internationally. We've seen it all over the world, and that's how it was experienced. It was an unsuccessful genocide because we are still here. We still have our cultures, our languages. There's been a tremendous amount of damage done, but it did not surprise me at all that it was that Justice Sinclair described it as cultural genocide. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada also did the same thing last week, and nor was I surprised by the backlash against.
So let me ask you about that, because that word genocide, and I've talked about this in various interviews. There is great debate about when the word genocide should be used, and the UN has, as you just say, has a very precise definition about. Other people think it should be expanded. So, deal with the pushback. How is genocide the right term?
It was because the Canadian state, the Canadian body politic, set its mind to the assimilation and of Indigenous people into Canadian society with an express objective of, everybody's familiar now with that phrase, or most people should be, with of killing the Indian in the child, rendering them something other than Indian, Secwepemc, Cree, Anishinaabe, so that they were indistinguishable from non-Indigenous Canadians culturally, economically, politically. And when it was done through residential school, that was reaching into our communities, into our families, into our homes, removing our children with a view to them never coming back as such. And that eliminates, that is the quickest way, other than just mowing us down, that is the quickest way to eliminate a people, is the removal, most effective way, remove their children permanently.
Let's talk about the other half of that term, the cultural part. What does that mean to you when you hear that term in this context?
Culture means a lot of things, but certainly for Indigenous people, and I think every culture and every people everywhere, we transmit culture not just through ceremony, not just in school, not just through ritual, but in our day-to-day interactions. How you view the world, how you should relate to other people, verbally, non-verbally, morally, ethically, politically, the language you speak, the way you view your own spirituality and the spiritual world. All of that is cultural, and all of that is transmitted 24 hours a day from birth. So when you remove a child from their cultural environment and place them in a different cultural environment, an alien, foreign cultural environment, you cut them off from who they are, and you're trying to make them into something else.
Is it possible, and this is sort of transition to the reconciliation part of the equation, is it possible, given how much you say has been lost culturally, is it possible to now, starting in 2015, to rebuild those lost cultures?
Many of them, not all. Sadly, much of the knowledge, some of the languages, and the culture, all the things that make up culture, for some people in some communities has likely been lost forever. And every community, every Indigenous community and culture in Canada has suffered profound losses in the transmission of knowledge and spirituality and vibrancy. But many, many cultures and communities in Canada are in a position, once you remove the impediments to re-enlivening, rediscovering, strengthening, and transmitting culture to, and the primary, you have to do it, children. Children are the focal point for the transmission of culture.
Okay, let's talk about this reconciliation part of this. Prime Minister Harper, previous to him, Prime Minister Chrétien, both made official apologies for residential schools. Did that help?
In some ways. I think once these apologies came from the leader of the Canadian government, it was no longer possible with any credibility for pundits, for so-called experts, for commentators, for Canadians to say, as they did for many years, hey, we were actually doing you guys a favor. You got a free education. We didn't get that level of services and free room and board. And we were just trying to do the best intentioned something for your own good. People, of course, are still saying that, including some people in the national media through some of the publications, but it's not credible. It's not credible politically, intellectually, academically. It doesn't make any sense, and the apologies moved the marker on that. Sorry
and reconciliation, not equivalent. One's a starting point to help try and achieve
It's
the
a
other
precondition.
one. Okay, so the TRC is asking the Catholic Church, the Pope specifically, to apologize for its role in the residential schools, running the schools. What would that mean to hear that apology from Pope Francis?
I think for children and for adults, for survivors who attended Catholic residential schools, many of whom they've made their peace with the Church, and they still practice the faith, their adherence to the Catholic faith, but they were at the schools. They know what was done to them, and they know why, and they know how. They experienced it in the most visceral and brutal and direct way possible. And their church, and of course many of them have disavowed the Church, but their church, the people who had custody of them for all of their youth and their adolescence, hasn't even acknowledged that anything was done wrong. And again, it's a precondition to reconciliation. Many, many people who attended Catholic residential schools are no longer practice the faith. But for the ones who do, I think it would be tremendously valuable.
Okay, the 94 recommendations, this is a 400-page report. It is a dense one with big recommendations. And as I said earlier, everything from education to health. Education, as Justice Sinclair said, is the truth part.
Yeah.
This is how everyone can agree, to put it sort of lamely, that this happened. What out of the recommendations for you are the most important?
I think there's two that stand out for me, although I think the 94 recommendations as a comprehensive package, I think if they're not holistically implemented, then there will always be ongoing harm and discrimination. But the two most important are with respect to Aboriginal child welfare and missing and murdered women. Those are critical needs because things are happening today to children, to women and children in this country, Indigenous women and children, that bear a remarkable resemblance to the residential school experience.
Okay,
And that can and should be
Let's
prevented.
talk about those two and why you feel they're so important. So the first is the welfare of Aboriginal children.
Yes.
So what specifically needs to be done?
The stopping the unnecessary removal of Indigenous children from their families, from their cultures, from their community, from their homes. That is still done as a default. You think about in the non-Indigenous Canadian society, it is an extraordinary and very rare thing for a child to be removed from a home by the state for their own well-being and protection. In Indigenous communities and families, everybody knows somebody, and it's a default, it's a go-to. And that has to change. People are struggling, it's true, people are struggling because of intergenerational effects for a whole host of reasons. That does not mean that it's in the best interests of their children to have them removed. That should stop.
And in the cases where children are removed for appropriate reasons, where should they go?
They should go to, first and foremost, unless there's an extraordinary set of circumstances, to a member of their extended family, to someone they already know, into a home they already know, or to remain in their existing home, have their parents go, and this is an approach that's being adopted by some Manitoba First Nations, and others are considering it, where the parents on reserve are removed from the home involuntarily if there's a protection concern, and other caregivers go into the home. So the children don't need to move, it's the parents that leave.
And the reason that you say this should happen is so they can be surrounded by their culture and grow up in their cultures.
By people who aren't being paid to take care of them, but who love them, who have their best interests at heart, their family.
You also raise an inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginal women. Prime Minister Harper has made no commitment to that. In fact, the government has said it's not going to happen, or has suggested at least that it's not going to happen. So on Tuesday, the report comes out, he won't commit to the recommendations. What do you think when you hear that?
I think he's showing contempt for the lives, for our safety and well-being as Indigenous women, and for the families who've lost loved ones, for Indigenous communities, and frankly for Canadians. He's suggesting that Canadian society does not care. That when an Indigenous woman goes missing and is found dead, defiled, that it's not a significant thing, that this is happening every day, every week, every month in Canada, that women and girls go missing, that, on my Facebook page, sometimes 3-4 a day, missing girls and women, I circulate amongst my friends. So it's, and everybody amongst Indigenous communities and families and societies, we all know women and girls who've just gone.
And beyond that, he's committed to none of the recommendations, 94 of them.
Yes, even though municipalities, educators, provincial governments have already committed and are already undertaking some of the very activities that, with mixed success, with mixed resources, with mixed levels of commitment. But to have the federal government, who has the direct accountability and the fiduciary obligation to Indigenous people in this country pursuant to treaty and constitution, to say this is not our problem, we're not going to take any action, we're in action when the suffering is ongoing and the harm is ongoing and in some cases escalating. There's more children in care now, Aboriginal children in care now, than there ever were in their residential school days. So it's not surprising, but it's beyond disappointing.
Okay, beyond relations at a governmental level, and Justice Sinclair said this, Perry Bellegarde, the head of the AFN, talked about this in reaction this week, this is about also reconciliation between Aboriginal people in our country and other Canadians. What impact do you think this TRC report, whether or not the recommendations are implemented in an official way, might have on bridging that gap?
It's an enormous project. Not that the TRC has done its work, it's got its report, the fuller report will follow, but for Canadians, for Canadian society, it's an enormous project. It's a resource, the existing report and the fuller report to come is a resource for Canadian families, for Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians, to read, to learn, to hear from survivors themselves, to hear from experts, policy and other experts, about what happened, why, how do we change it, how do we reconcile? For schools, for educators, from nursery school up to graduate and professional schools. And I think it's beholden on educators. That's a big part of the recommendations. And I think it's beholden on educators to embrace the report and to consider how, not whether, but how they are going to implement it in their classroom, in their board, in their ministry, at their university, at their faculty. For professions, everybody all professions, particularly those that have any contact with Indigenous people and particularly Indigenous children. I don't think professionals are competent when they deal with Indigenous. They're not capable of not harming the children. That's true of teachers, social workers, lawyers, judges, nurses, doctors. I'm not sure if I would include certified accountants. I'm not sure whether. But all the regulated professions, for example, and the schools that train the regulated professionals, they should be embracing these recommendations and implementing them.
Catherine, thank you. This is the start of many more changes that many people hope to come, but it was a big week for all Canadians. Thank you for talking with me. Appreciate it.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.